Today, Thursday, 31st October, I shall mostly concentrate on the situation in Ukraine, where there have been further important developments on the military side. But first, I'm going to discuss various statements that President Zelensky of Ukraine has made in a recent press conference. And I'm going to touch on briefly a few diplomatic developments such as they are. Now, President Zelensky, over the last couple of days, has given a press conference in which he has expressed in frankly angry terms his disapproval of the leak in the United States, in the New York Times to be precise, of the fact that he had asked, as one of the annexes to his peace plan, the United States should supply Ukraine with long-range cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, in an earlier program, I said that I would wait until we had the official Ukrainian translation of Zelensky's press conference appearing on his website. Now, I've been waiting for this to appear on the website, and I can't find it. It looks as if it isn't there. Many things that Zelensky says do not appear on his website, at least I can't find them, at least not in English. I ought to say that I've always found Zelensky's website a difficult information tool. Usually I like to look at the websites and reports that all governments produce. But as I said, Zelensky's website is a particular challenge. I find his rhetoric very difficult to understand much of the time. It appears very unstructured. And beyond that, I also have to say that the layout of the website and the way in which his speeches are set out in dense, long paragraphs, I find it a struggle to read through them. So it's possible that somewhere, squirreled in this website, there is somewhere his press conference. But I can't find it. I've looked, I've searched, and it doesn't seem to be there. But it does seem to me that what Zelensky did say over the course of this press conference was important and what was interesting, and therefore I've decided to talk about it on this channel and to start with it. And obviously I'm doing so on the basis of press reports, though I've no reason to doubt that these press reports are accurate. The first thing to say is that Zelensky, over the course of this press conference, returned to the topic of the Kursk offensive, and he denied that Ukraine had at any time had the objective to capture the new Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, he's saying this at the very end of October. The Kursk offensive began on the 6th of August. It's surprising, at least to me, that if Ukraine had never had the purpose of capturing the Kursk nuclear power plant, that Zelensky didn't mention this fact, and no other Ukrainian official confirmed this fact at an earlier date, maybe not in the first few days and weeks of the Kursk offensive, when I accept there might have been some logic in keeping the Russians guessing about what the Ukrainians were going to do. But certainly later, after the dust had settled, when the Russians were still talking about the Ukrainian objective to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, and one would have thought that by that point, providing clarification on this important question would have been important. So I wanted to say that at the outset. But then, of course, one looks at the reported words that Zelensky used, and suffice to say, the doubts begin to grow. It's because These are reported words that have appeared in the media that I was anxious to get the official Ukrainian translation of his words. But as I said, it doesn't look like we're ever going to get one. And what Zelensky said is that it would have been the easiest thing in the world for the Ukrainian army to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. The Russian army, it turns out, is so weak that he couldn't have prevented the Ukrainians doing that. And the only reason that the Ukrainians didn't capture the Kursk nuclear power plant was because they didn't intend to. Ukraine, it seems, unlike Russia, does not attack or attempt to capture nuclear power plants. Except, of course, that it does. Now, I say that because back in the autumn of 2022, as I well remember, I got particularly badly burnt by a story, a piece of information that the Russians had circulated about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The Russian Defense Ministry gave a lengthy and very detailed account of a Ukrainian commando operation. A large group, several hundred Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers, supposedly crossed the Kurakovo reservoir on boats, their plan being to storm the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and to bring it back under Russian control. However, the entire operation was detected by the Russians. The boats were destroyed, or most of them were destroyed, on the reservoir. The soldiers that did manage to land, the Ukrainian soldiers that did manage to land, were caught in a firefight and they were all defeated. And the Russian Defense Ministry went ahead and said that this was a good example of the reckless and irresponsible way in which the Ukrainians were acting, trying to take a nuclear power plant like the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to storm it by force. By contrast, of course, the Russians, when they captured the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, as they have been careful to point out on multiple occasions, they didn't have to storm the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant because when they arrived, it was completely undefended and their troops simply walked in. Well, this is an account of an operation that the Russians gave, a Ukrainian operation to storm the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and it seemed to me so completely zany that I discounted it. I did programs at the time, more than one I seem to remember, in which I said that I thought this couldn't possibly be true. It looked so far-fetched and unlikely that I had to believe that the Russians were, for their own reasons, making the whole thing up. Except it turned out that they were not. A couple of weeks later, in fact some months later, as I remember, the London Times, I think it was the London Times, published a lengthy report describing the entire operation from the Ukrainian point of view and explaining how it failed. It was an account which corresponded very closely with the Russian account. And then some months after that, Kirill Budanov himself, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, and apparently, again, the inventor, the mind behind this operation, he came forward and himself admitted that the Ukrainians had attempted it and that it failed. So my initial skepticism turned out to be completely wrong. And in fact, that attack that the Ukrainians launched on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, that attempt to capture it through some kind of commando raid, proved to be only the first of several. Several other rather similar attacks took place. I even have a vague memory of the Ukrainians creating some kind of extraordinary barge, armoured barge, with which they also tried to send troops across the Kurachovo reservoir to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And the barge, I seem to remember, ran aground. And anyway, it fell into the hand of the Russians, and they were able to provide us with rather dramatic pictures of it. So when Zelensky says that the Ukrainians don't do this sort of thing, well, they have done, or at least they've tried to, except, of course, that it hasn't worked. All right, if you want to stretch, you could say that the Ukrainians have not sought to take by force nuclear power plants that belong to Russia. You could argue that a distinction can be made with the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. After all, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, that is Ukrainian. They were simply seeking to recapture it. So you can make that distinction. But I have to say, I think that is a rather laborious distinction to make, given what Zelensky is reported to have said. My understanding is that he was saying that the Ukrainians don't attempt to conduct storming operations of nuclear power plants, whereas, as we've seen, the reality is that on at least one occasion, and in fact on more than one occasion, with the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, they have actually done so. So that's one reason to have some skepticism about Zelensky's story. But with respect to the Kursk nuclear power plant, there is actually a lot more reason than that, because what Zelensky is saying, that the Russian army is weak, and was presumably weak in Kursk region, that it would have been a straightforward thing for the Ukrainians to walk in and to capture the power plant, and that the Russians wouldn't have been able to prevent it, is completely contrary to my own recollection of events of the fighting in Kursk in those important first 2 weeks of the offensive in August. The reality, as I remember, was that the Ukrainians did cross the border. They then marched on the town of Sudzha, which is located right on the border. They got involved in a complicated fight to capture that small town, which they did eventually capture, though it took them some time to do so. By the time they did that, Russian reinforcements had already arrived, and the main road from Sudzha to the city of Kursk and to the neighboring town of Kurchatov had by that point been blocked by the Russian army. The Ukrainians then tried to advance north along country roads, but were blocked again. They then made an attempt to capture the strategically important village, actually small town of Korenovo, somewhere to the northwest of this area. The Russians were able to prevent them capturing Korenovo, and it became clear after about 10 days that all attempts by the Ukrainians, including attempts by their reconnaissance groups to reach the Kursk nuclear power plant, had actually failed. The Ukrainians did, at one point, as I remember, publish a picture of a Ukrainian soldier standing next to what appeared to be a road sign outside the village of Lvov, located very close to Kurchatov and to the nuclear power plant. But I think it's subsequently established that that picture was a fake. So the evidence, as I very well remember, and I discussed it at great length at that time, you can go back to my videos in August and you will see that I discuss it all very thoroughly. My recollection, my very clear recollection, is that the Ukrainians did indeed attempt to move north. They did indeed attempt to move towards the nuclear power plant. They weren't able to reach the nuclear power plant, not because they chose not to, but because, contrary to what Zelensky is saying, they weren't strong enough, and the Russians were strong, so strong, that they succeeded in stopping them. So, what Zelensky is saying, all of this circumstantial detail that he's provided, that there was no intention to capture the nuclear power plant because that is not what the Ukrainians do, and that the Ukrainians could have done it because the Russians were weak, and it would have been straightforward to walk in and to capture it. I don't believe him. And the reason I don't believe him is because, like many people who say things that they know are not true, he has provided an enormous amount of circumstantial detail to try to support his assertions, except the circumstantial detail, the claim that the Ukrainians don't storm nuclear power plants, and the Russians at the time were too weak to resist the Ukrainians, that circumstantial detail turns out to be all wrong. In my experience, when people are simply saying things as they were, they tend to do so simply. It's when they try to mislead that they, as I said, give all of this circumstantial information, and by doing that, when it turns out to be wrong, they give the game away. And suffice to say that in light of all of that, I'm treating Zelensky's statements perhaps not exactly as an admission, but as a further clue, a very important clue, that contrary to what he's now saying, the KURSK nuclear power plant and the facility nearby where the Russians stored tactical nuclear warheads, that those were indeed the Ukrainian objectives when the KURSK operation was first launched. Now, I think one reason, by the way, why Zelensky is giving these denials now is because the situation of the Ukrainians in the Kursk pocket is becoming extremely bad. There is probably some internal discussion within Ukraine. People are saying we're losing men and machines in the Kursk pocket. Everywhere else along the front lines, things are falling apart. We can't afford to throw away men and machines in the Kursk pocket in the way that we are. The original objective, the seizure of the Kursk power plant and the warehouse, were not achieved. So let us pull back. And Zelensky is coming out publicly and he's saying those were never our objectives. We are still fulfilling our objectives by remaining there. He's very nebulous, of course, as to what those objectives now actually are. But anyway, the point is, he doesn't want to pull the troops out because his personal prestige is invested in them remaining there. So this is, I think, what explains Zelensky's words on this issue. Now, I've gone into this in some detail. I've taken a somewhat forensic approach, taking apart his words and explanations. Again, If you want to disagree, that's fair enough. Nobody is obliged to agree with me on this, but I am quite sure, in fact, I am fully confident this time that my analysis of Zelensky's words are absolutely right, and that inadvertently and admittedly in contradiction to what he appears to be saying, he has in effect confirmed that the Kursk nuclear power plant certainly was an objective of the Ukrainians after all. Anyway, that's one thing. Now, Zelensky has also said a lot of other things, and one of the things he's talked about, and in fact his reasons for calling the press conference, was his anger. He's very publicly expressed anger about the rejection by the United States of his demand for Tomahawk cruise missiles, and the fact that the United States, or some officials within the United States, feel that this proposal was so far-fetched that they needed to have the fact that it was made and the fact that it was rejected made public by having it published in an article in the New York Times. Well, Zelensky is absolutely furious about this, and in fact that was the main reason why he called the press conference. He was furious that his request for Tomahawk missiles, contained in one of the secret annexes of his victory plan, was leaked to the media in this way, and he went out of his way to criticize the administration, and he made it pretty clear that it was the administration he was criticizing. He went out of his way to criticize the administration for doing this thing to him. Now, I think that this does repay some discussion. Now, in previous programs, I've pointed out that Zelensky's expectation that a demand like this would not be publicized by the United States, that they would respect his desire for secrecy, was, to say the least, naive. But maybe in this program, I should focus instead on perhaps the more important fact, both about this request and about the way in which the Americans have rejected it. Because what Zelensky is demanding is actually outrageous. Tomahawk cruise missiles are strategic weapons. They have ranges that extend over thousands of kilometers. They could certainly reach Moscow from Ukraine. They can be ground launched. When there were plans to deploy them in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands in the 1980s, they were going to be deployed from ground-based launchers. The ones in Britain were going to be located in Greenham Common, as I remember, and there was a huge amount of protest about their presence there. And even then they could have reached targets in Russia. And of course, those Tomahawk cruise missiles would have been nuclear tipped. And the United States has recently constructed missile bases in Romania as part of the Aegis offshore system. In theory, these bases are supposed to house anti-missile systems intended to shoot down ballistic missiles. The presence of these bases has been a major point of contention between the United States and Russia. The Russians have strongly opposed and criticized the deployment of these bases. And the reason they do so, and they've made this very clear, is because the ground-based launchers in Poland and Romania, whilst they can indeed launch anti-ballistic missiles, can also be adapted to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles. And the Russians, I think entirely justifiably, believe that that is what the Americans ultimately intend to do. So it is possible to position Tomahawk cruise missiles in Europe and to launch them from ground facilities. And it is possible to adapt these missiles or to build variants of these missiles with exceptionally long ranges. And these missiles, of course, as was the case in the 1980s, can be equipped or could be equipped or could be designed to be equipped to carry nuclear warheads. That is going to play to the greatest Russian insecurities. One of the things that the Russians have repeatedly brought up in multiple discussions is that if Ukraine were to join NATO, the United States might establish missile bases in Ukraine, missile bases intended to threaten Russia with nuclear weapons. And as Ray McGovern of VIPS, former top CIA analyst, the man who used to deliver to the President of the United States the President's daily brief, as Ray McGovern has repeatedly and completely correctly pointed out, this was brought up by Putin in direct discussions with Joe Biden in the immediate weeks and the weeks immediately prior to the start of the special military operation. And there was a brief moment after a virtual meeting between Biden and Putin, I believe it was in January 2022, when the Russians believed that Biden had told them that the United States had no plans to establish missile bases in Ukraine. And there was a brief moment of euphoria around that in Moscow. I remember it well. And I remember Ushakov, Putin's spokesman, talking about this. And then shortly after, the United States walked President Biden's concession back. And a few months ago, Sergei Lavrov, no less, talked about how he then had a further meeting with US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who made it clear in most defiant terms that the United States would position missiles, place its missiles wherever it chose. And that was one of the factors which, according to Lavrov and Putin and other Russian officials, led them to launch the special military operation. So here we have Zelensky coming forward and telling the Americans, look, we have the special military operation. Ukraine is under attack. The Russians are advancing all along the front lines. And nonetheless, and notwithstanding, we still want you to open missile bases which can strike at targets deep inside Russia, in fact, all the way up to the Urals, and missiles that could potentially carry nuclear weapons. And we want you to locate these in Ukraine, despite the fact that the Russians have responded to this in the way that they have done. It is, in effect, another demand from Zelensky for the United States to do something that would quite plausibly provoke not just an overwhelming reaction from the Russians, but which could bring us into an outright nuclear confrontation and even a nuclear exchange leading all the way up to World War III. And Zelensky made this proposal to the Americans. He made this demand to the Americans. He wanted the Americans to give him these weapons, and he wanted the fact to be kept secret. He wanted the United States to commit itself or to agree to do this thing, this incredibly reckless and dangerous thing, and to keep it secret from the Russians, obviously, from the Ukrainian public also, from the European public too, and of course also from the public of the United States. It's not even clear to me whether Zelensky intended that Congress should be informed. Notice that Zelensky apparently was not sharing these secret provisions of his victory plan, which included provisions for Tomahawk missiles. He was not disclosing those secret provisions when he addressed the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. So this is what Zelensky wants the United States to do, to commit itself to Ukraine, to a course that could not implausibly take us all the way to World War III, and to keep silent about it, thereby presumably preventing any debate. Now, I have to say, this leaves me speechless. The level of arrogance, the degree of entitlement, the complete indifference to the fate of Ukraine, Europe, the future of humanity, the world. Following on from his earlier comments just 10 days or so ago about nuclear weapons. Anyway, as I said, it leaves me completely speechless. And the childish tantrum he has thrown when someone in the United States took the entirely sensible decision, given what Zelensky was proposing, to make the fact public to the world and to the American people. This incredible childish tantrum, again, to my mind, provides a very, very serious insight into Zelensky's personality. Now, unsurprisingly, the Americans have rejected this utterly reckless plan. It is incredibly disturbing that there seem to be some people in Europe and even in the United States who are apparently not particularly bothered by this plan. They're prepared to take on these incredible risks and to go on giving Zelensky what he wants. They are so fixated with the importance of waging war against Russia until some kind of victory is achieved, a victory which, in conventional terms, as they must all know by now, is impossible. They are prepared to take these incredible risks and to satisfy Zelensky's vanity and his sense of entitlement in order to do that. But it's clear to me that the Pentagon at least has said no, enough's enough. And this has apparently led to a major hardening of the Pentagon's position over the last couple of weeks. That's why the Ramstein conference was called off. That is why the United States refused to participate in Zelensky's latest peace conference idea. That is why US officials have been busy trashing Zelensky's peace plan. That is also why American officials are now leaking to The Economist that the United States has now exhausted its ability to go on supplying weapons to Ukraine, that continuing to do so would expose the United States to unacceptable risks. It would leave American arsenals dangerously depleted to the point where that might cause a crisis if the United States were to find itself in some military situation somewhere else, all of which is true. But I have to say, in the light of what we now know about Zelensky's demand, his proposal for Tomahawk missiles, I think we are justified in reading those words about how Zelensky's demands are becoming dangerous. Continued supply of weapons to Ukraine is becoming dangerous for the United States. I think we are now justified in reading those words in an additional way. Zelensky is now asking the United States to do things which could potentially put the United States itself in direct jeopardy. And of course, the Russians, what they said, what Putin himself has said, that Ukraine cannot operate ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow missiles by itself, that it would need American and British, and in the case of the Taurus missiles, German technicians to do all the work to prepare the missiles for launch. What the Russians said about that applies equally and even more so to the Tomahawk missiles. In fact, if Tomahawk missiles were ever located in Ukraine, either in a ground launch role or even conceivably an air launch role, they would ultimately have to be controlled and operated by Americans. So there we are. That's Zelensky. That's the nature of the person who leads Ukraine at the moment. He is prepared to take unbelievable, reckless risks, not just for Ukraine itself, which he does all the time, every day, by the way, but risks to put at risk the peace of Europe, the United States itself, and embrace risks that even go beyond that. And he doesn't care about what the potential consequences might be. He tells everybody that the Russians are bluffing and that we shouldn't pay any attention to what they say, as if that is a remotely responsible position for any global leader, any world leader to take with respect to a country that possesses more nuclear weapons than any other and the means for their delivery. But anyway, he invites us to do that, and he appears to be completely reckless as to the potential consequences. As I said, the whole affair leaves me speechless, and I would have thought that Western leaders, other Western leaders, European leaders, ought to be drawing appropriate conclusions. After all, the Pentagon appears to have done so. They have clearly decided that this person, Zelensky, should be kept at a firm distance, that this conflict in Ukraine has gone as far as it can go. One would assume that others would be taking the same view. Except, of course, that they haven't. Every day, with every single passing day, we get more and more reports of more and more leaders in Europe still dancing to Zelensky's increasingly dangerous tune. Over the last couple of days, in fact, Zelensky has been, I believe it's been in Iceland, he's been addressing the Nordic Council. One of the most depressing and indeed alarming developments of the last couple of years is the way that the Scandinavian countries, which once had a tremendous statecraft throughout the Cold War, they were consistent voices of reason and sanity. Anyway, they appear to have thrown themselves at his feet, which I find incredible. Anyway, there he was, and he was back talking to the Nordic Council, talking up his victory plan, demanding again an invitation to join NATO, talking about all of these things, these incredibly dangerous things that he apparently wants to do. And one of these Scandinavian leaders, as two Chinese people have pointed out to me, Chinese members of the community, well, one of them, to give her name, was Sofia Midkiff, small town voice. She told me about this yesterday. But another one, a member of the Duran community, who's actually based in Finland. Anyway, they pointed out to me that one of these Scandinavian leaders, Alexander Stubb, the new president of Finland, incredibly hawkish, extremely anti-Russian, leading a country, Finland, which once had excellent relations, first with the Soviet Union and then with Russia, relations which enabled Finland not only to enjoy peace, but to prosper and to become that wealthy, stable, social democratic Scandinavian democracy that it once was, and which I well remember from my travels to Finland in days gone by. Anyway, Alexander Stubb, he goes to China. He brings a significant delegation of Finnish businessmen with him. He understands that Finland, having destroyed its once immensely important and vitally important economic relationship with Russia, needs nonetheless to have good relations with China. He goes to China and he meets the Chinese Prime Minister there, and then he meets President Xi Jinping, and he delivers an astonishing speech in which he criticizes China's approach to the Ukraine war right in Xi Jinping's face. He talks about how the Brazilian and Chinese peace plan is all wrong, how the correct and proper approach is to support Zelensky's victory plan, the plan which we now know includes this demand for Ukraine to be provided with Tomahawk missiles, and also that the only acceptable outcome remains Zelensky's peace plan, the plan for the unconditional capitulation of Russia and for the total withdrawal of the Russians from every millimeter of post-1991 and pre-2014 Ukraine. And, well, I saw the faces of the Chinese officials and of the Chinese journalists who were listening to these words, and frankly, they looked stony, and I'm not surprised. And if President Stubb thought that he was impressing the Chinese by talking in that way, I can give him a little word of advice. He wasn't. Anyway, there we are. So we see how incredibly dangerous this whole thing with Ukraine has become. Meanwhile, of course, President Zelensky, he doesn't just talk about his victory plan and his peace plan. He also, every so often, gives indicators that he does indeed want to talk with the Russians. And this now brings me to the other story that has attracted a certain amount of attention over the last couple of days. And this is an article that appeared in the Financial Times on the 29th of October. Ukraine and Russia in talks about halting strikes on energy plants. Qatar-mediated discussions mark resumption of previous efforts abandoned after Kiev's invasion of Kursk region. And that, of course, refers back to the story which appeared in the United States, I believe it was in the New York Times, back in August, that there'd been talks at that time between the Russians and the Ukrainians about a mutual cessation of attacks on each side's energy facilities, and that the talks had almost come to fruition, that there'd almost been an agreement, and that agreement was then thrown into the dustbin by the Russians when the Ukrainians invaded Kursk region. That was the story in August. Now, at the time, when I read that story, I think it was in the New York Times, I thought it must be true, except that in the days that followed, the Russians denied it. They said, and this was said by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, by Lavrov himself, and in an interview that we did with him, Glenn Deason and myself, by Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky, who is a senior member of Russia's delegation to the UN Security Council. Well, they all said that they knew absolutely nothing about such talks. I mean, Polyansky said that he'd heard no reports that any such talks had taken place. Lavrov said that the Russians wouldn't enter into talks of this kind, that the Ukrainians were constantly coming up with ideas for talks of this nature, that they were all the product of the various working parties that the Ukrainians had set up after the peace conference, the so-called peace conference, that took place in June, the one where most of the countries failed to turn up, and many of the countries which did turn up refused to sign the final statement. Lavrov made the point that there were various working parties that had been set up after that conference, and one of them was all about trying to get a mutual cessation of attacks on energy facilities. But Lavrov said that the Russians would never engage in those discussions for the simple reason that the purpose of all of these working parties and of all of these discussions was to bring the Russians eventually to the point where they were obliged to agree to Zelensky's peace plan, which was something that the Russians would never do. So that was what the Russians were saying in August. And then I read this article in the Financial Times and notice that the title of the article that says Ukraine and Russia in talks about halting strikes on energy plants, and that the subtitle says that the discussions have resumed, and then the first paragraph rather casts doubt upon that. Ukraine and Russia are in preliminary discussions about halting strikes on each other's energy infrastructure. So preliminary discussions rather casts doubt about whether there are in fact discussions. It sounds more like talks about talks. And then we learn the next paragraph that goes on to say Kiev was seeking to resume Qatar-mediated negotiations that came close to agreement in August before being derailed by Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. And that was said, so that's seeking to resume negotiations, which again rather suggests that negotiations were not in fact underway, contrary to what this Financial Times article implies. And then the Financial Times article says that they've got all of this information from people familiar with the matter, and we then learn that one of those people includes, or some of those people include, senior Ukrainian officials. We're not told that any Russian officials, actual serving Russian officials, are amongst the people who the Financial Times has consulted, except we're told that the Financial Times has spoken to a former senior Kremlin official, briefed on the talks. So that is not someone who is a current Russian official, just saying. And of course, he's been briefed on the talks, but briefed by whom? By the Financial Times? By the Ukrainians? Where is this person? Is he in Moscow? Is he in the West? There are some former Russian officials in the West. Anatoly Chubais, the former privatization minister, is a former senior Kremlin official. He is in conflict with the Russian government, and he is in the West. So it looks to me as if when you unpack it, when you look carefully at the sources, all of this comes from the Ukrainians and it doesn't come from the Russians at all. Now, as I said, the Russians denied the story back in August, and this story, this latest article in the Financial Times, has received a great deal of coverage, including on independent media, by the way. I noticed that lots of people assume that these discussions really are underway. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, is aware of the fact that the Russians have actually categorically denied this story. And you can find the denial. In fact, it's one of several denials, I believe, but this is the denial that I noticed. Anyway, you can find this denial on the official Russian news agency TASS. This denial appeared yesterday, and it reads this way: Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated that even reputable publications like the Financial Times are not immune to spreading misinformation following reports about alleged talks to persuade Russia to cease attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And then TASS quotes Peskov as saying, "Today, many fakes circulate that have no relation to reality. Even the most respected outlets do not hesitate to publish such fabrications," he told reporters. And TASS tells us that Peskov was specifically made this statement after he was asked questions which specifically referred to the Financial Times article. So there we are. Peskov is clearly denying the story. He's saying it is fake. It is fake that the Financial Times is apparently not immune to spreading misinformation, and that they publish fakes that have no relation to reality. So there we are. I take all of this to be a clear denial from the Kremlin that any talks of that nature are in fact taking place, or that the Russians are even interested in these talks. Again, it all looks to me very much like the same story, the same game that Zelensky and his officials have been playing, at least since the start of the year. They pretended, and the Swiss went along with them, in pretending that the Russians had been invited to participate fully in the peace conference that took place in Switzerland. It then turned out that that was not the case, that the Russians were invited to send a delegation to the peace conference, but it was not intended that they would participate in its actual discussions. They were to be in another room, and when the peace conference had come to a consensus, then the Russians were to be presented with that consensus, which would be, of course, support for Zelensky's peace plan, with the Russians presented with it effectively in the form of an ultimatum. And it was clearly an attempt to lure the Russians into negotiations, which the Russians were not going to let themselves do. The Russians said back in August that this is what the talks about the cessation of the attacks on the energy systems were all about also. And essentially what they're now saying is that there's no serious proposal for talks, and the report in the Financial Times that talks like that are underway is fake and untrue. So, again, no real move towards negotiations. And I think this is an essential thing to understand. We will no doubt get all kinds of false leads coming from Kiev over the next few weeks and months as the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. But certainly whilst Zelensky remains in place, no one should think that this will lead to any real process of negotiation between Kiev and Moscow. For the record, I said I find it very difficult to read Zelensky's comments on his blog, on his news site, on his presidential site. But I have worked my way through the various things he said at the Nordic Council. I'm not going to read them. And I also worked through the equally implacable things that were said by some of Zelensky's officials in Canada, where they've also been attending a conference. And I don't see the slightest sign there of Zelensky or of his officials being willing to compromise on anything. I should say that this has been the consistent pattern of the Maidan movement, to which Zelensky now belongs. Maybe he didn't once, but he does now. The consistent pattern of the Maidan movement ever since it first appeared on the scene during the Orange Revolution all the way back in 2004. It makes its demands, maximalist demands, and it never retreats from them. It sometimes likes to give the impression that it is prepared to enter into negotiations, as they did on the 21st of February 2014, when they signed what appeared to be a peace agreement with President Yanukovych in the presence of EU officials, EU foreign ministers, or as they did with the two Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. But in no case have they ever actually followed through on those concessions. They've always reverted back ultimately to their underlying maximalist demands, which I think psychologically they are never going to retreat from. They cannot retreat from. So there it is. People should not be misled by brief interviews that Zelensky gives about mutual cessations of attacks on energy systems. Stories about how something like that was negotiated briefly in the winter of 2022, 2023, and then fell apart when the Ukrainians started launching attacks on the Russian energy system, drone attacks on the Russian energy system. That, by the way, again, misrepresents completely, as I remember it, the actual history of the missile strikes that took place in the spring of 2023. I'm not going to discuss this at length now. But anyway, none of this, as I said, to my mind, is for real. If you want Zelensky's authentic voice, you saw it at the press conference, you saw it in his demand for Tomahawk missiles, you saw it in his insistence that a demand like that needed to be kept secret, and in his furious reaction when the Americans decided that they had no option but to disclose it. Anyway, one of the things that, of course, explains all these various moves is the deterioration of Ukraine's position on the front lines. And in fact, there's been some comment about that from Peskov himself. And presumably, over the course of the same press conference, Peskov made exactly that point, that it is the deterioration of the military situation on the battlefronts that is making the Ukrainians come up with all kinds of proposals, seemingly reasonable, but ultimately leading nowhere, and these extraordinary demands. And the TASS report of Peskov's words perhaps can be read in full. And that's what I'm going to now do. The Kiev regime is quite nervous due to unfavorable developments on the battlefield. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, "The situation on the front lines is clear and obvious. Everyone in our country can see it, and Western nations are also noting how events are unfolding." And TASS goes on to say, Peskov emphasized that current trends are making the Kiev regime quite nervous. He suggested that this anxiety is why Zelensky has called on the United States to supply Kiev with Tomahawk long-range missiles. Peskov added that Zelensky's push to legitimize Western involvement in military operations is another factor at play. And then there's a direct quote, "Evidently, all the peace plans and victory plans, whether classified or not, are essentially attempts by Kiev to draw Western countries deeper into the conflict and legitimize that involvement. This is the ultimate goal of these maneuvers. That is how we, that is to say the Russians, perceive it." So there we go. That's where we are as of now. You can see also from Peskov's words the complete skepticism that the Russians now have about any proposal that the Ukrainians make to them. They no longer believe that the Ukrainians have good faith in anything they say. Now, that inexorably leads me to a discussion of the situation on the battlefronts. And there's been actually quite a lot of important news. So here goes. The first thing to say is that today, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village of Yasnaya Polyana, the village north of Shakhtarska, another village, all of these places are in the southern Donbass, just north of the recently captured, formerly fortified town of Ugleda. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry confirms that Yasnaya Polyana has indeed been captured by the Russian army. Now, the Russian army has not yet confirmed the capture of the larger village of Shakhtarska further south, but if the Russians control Yasnaya Polyana, it is likely that before long they will also be in full control of Shakhtarska, and of course it's possible that they already are. There is still apparently some fighting going on in the other village a little to the east, Novoukrainka. There are still Ukrainian troops in the northern part of this village, but it is very likely that they will retreat from this village also. And the Russians, apparently, having recently captured the village of Bogoyavlenka, further east, the village which, of course, the Russians call Dobrovilye. Anyway, they are also advancing northward from that village also towards the next Ukrainian defense line. And all of this, as I said, is being very widely reported. And recently, the Russians also captured the village of Katerinovka. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed the capture of that village also. And it seems that they are advancing also from that village too. Now, over a course of various programs, I have said that one of the most interesting things about this battle, the battle that is playing out between Pokrovsk, Novogrodivka, Selidovo, Kurakhovo, and Ugledar, this battle that's taking place over this huge territory, is that more than one Russian group of forces is involved in conducting this battle. I have pointed out that much of the fighting further north around Pokrovsk, in Novogrodivka, and in Selidovo, and north of the Kurakhovo reservoir, the fighting there is the responsibility of General Medvedchev's army, group of forces center. And the fighting in Ugledar, in Bogoyavlenka, in Yasnaya Polyana, in Shakhtarske, and in Novoukrainka is the responsibility of an entirely different group of forces, which is group of forces east, group of forces of Vostok. What I didn't realize is that there are, in fact, three groups of forces involved. The military force that captured Krasnogorovka and then went on to capture Novomikhailovka and Konstantinovka, and which has now captured Katerinovka and Maximilianovka and Ostrovsky and Gostria and all of these places east of Kurakhovo, whose forces have now broken into the main part of Kurakhovo. There's been an extraordinary operation in which it became clear that the Ukrainians had set up a line of dragon's teeth, so-called concrete pillars to prevent tanks and armored vehicles from breaking into Kurakhovo. They also positioned a tank to provide cover for the Ukrainian troops who were defending these dragon's teeth. The operators, the tank crew, for reasons I do not understand, left this tank and hid in nearby woods. The Russians tracked them. They launched drone attacks which killed the Ukrainian tank crew. They sent a commando unit on these extraordinary electric-powered motorcycles flying across the territory. This has been a major innovation of the Russian military. In the course of this war, they now use motorcycle-borne assault troops increasingly regularly and with very, very dramatic results. Anyway, sent a replacement tank crew, on these motorcycles. The crew disembarked, they clambered into the Ukrainian tank. The tank was then used to destroy the Dragon's Teeth, and then a large Russian armored column with the obstacle presented by the tank teeth destroyed was able to rumble in to the eastern part of Kurakovo itself. The whole thing was filmed, and you can actually find the film if you look hard enough in the relevant Telegram channels, and it's really actually quite dramatic. Anyway, a huge Russian armored column that way entered Kurakovo itself. There's now actual fighting going on within Kurakovo. It seems that some part of the eastern section of this town is now under Russian control. The Russians not only broke into Kurakovo in the way that I've said, but have established themselves in it. Anyway, the forces that have been conducting this offensive towards Kurakovo, the eastern part of Kurakovo, come from Group of Forces South. So we actually have three groups of forces: Groups of Forces Centre, Group of Forces South, and Group of Forces East, all of them coordinating together to conduct this offensive. Now, it is important to understand that it is not the case that every single unit of these groups of forces are working together in this operation. But these are three completely separate commands. They're clearly being coordinated and managed together. There is obviously someone in overall charge. Presumably, that person is General Gerasimov, running everything from the General Staff in Moscow, or perhaps some of his officials in the command center, the other command center in Rostov, who's to say. But anyway, a very complicated operation, which up to this point, it must be said, has been carried through faultlessly. All of these various different units and command forces are operating and have been operated very skillfully together. There's been a widespread view that the Russian military, over the course of this war, has not been successful in conducting complicated operations that require effective command and control of diverse forces operating across an extended battlefield. I think there was some truth to that in the first few months of the war in 2022, at a time when the Russians didn't even have a single officer in overall charge of the special military operation. A sign, by the way, as far as I am concerned, of how hurriedly the whole thing must have been put together. But clearly, they are coordinating successfully now. If they had problems doing that before, they no longer have those problems anymore. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. So the Russians conducting this very complex operation. And, well, I have discussed in previous programs how it looked to me as if some kind of pincer operation was in play, that the Russians looked like they were working towards some kind of major entrapment of the Ukrainian forces in Kurakovo, that having captured places like Selidovo and having advanced on towards Dmitrovka, which is another place that they're now attacking, that the Russians now seem to be in the process of moving north toward, moving west and moving north, pushing on from pushing north towards a cluster of villages. Another Dobrovilia, very confusingly, Verkhnia, Samara, Alexandropil, Constantinopol, all of these places, west of the Kurakovo Reservoir, which they clearly intend to gain control of, thereby ultimately cutting off the Ukrainian forces that are located there. And there seems to be some agreement that the Russian forces are converging on a village called Constantinople. And Constantinople lies somewhere to the west of Yasnaya Polyana, which the Russians have now captured, not a huge distance from Yasnaya Polyana. And it's been pointed out by all sorts of people who know about these things and who read the maps closely and who follow these things in a lot more detail than I do, that there are in fact no fortifications, that the Ukrainians have created no fortifications around these villages, Andreevka, Constantinople and Rozliv, that with the Russians now located in Yasnaya Polyana, they have an empty route to reach these villages. And if they capture these villages, as I said, they've already captured places to the north or are in the process of doing so. Novodimitrivka, they can attack these villages from the north, from Andreevka, from the north, from Novodimitrivka and Solyanka and those sort of places. They can advance upon these villages from the north, but they're even closer to these villages from the south, from Yasnaya Polyana, and that there are no Ukrainian defenses to hold them back. And that if these villages fall, if Constantinople specifically is captured and the other village of Rozliv and Andreevka, then the entire Kurakovo group of Ukrainian troops is surrounded. And, well, it seems we are now coming very, very close to this point, and we can see that 3 Russian armies, group of forces center, group of forces east, and group of forces south, are all converging towards that same objective. So, an enormous, dramatic, incredibly complicated battle playing out in southern Donbass, and an equally enormous battle apparently being prepared further north around Pokrovsk. There are reports that the Russians have recently intensified their shelling and bombing of positions around Pokrovsk. They're capturing all of the various fortified positions. There are some claims that even as of now, the fortifications of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd leave a great deal to be desired. There are reports that the Ukrainians are trying to put together such reserves as they still have to try to hold out in Pokrovsk. There are reports that Ukrainian troops are being redeployed to this area from Kharkiv region, from Kherson region, from Chasiv Yar, that the Ukrainians are sending whatever they can scratch together to try to hold their positions in and around Pokrovsk. But probably a mighty battle for Pokrovsk is likely to begin. And note that we are now in the rainy season. It's the period of the Rasputitsa, and we could see that despite all of the problems with the weather, the problems that are supposed to exist, there has been no difficulty, the Russians have had no difficulty up to this time in coordinating this very complicated operation that they're conducting across the southern steppe, and the weather and the mud doesn't seem to be slowing them. Just to say. Well, there's been other news from other places. There's been a lot more reports apparently from Chasiv Yar, which I have not managed to keep fully abreast of. But I gather that there's now more pictures of more Russian troops operating along one of the major supply roads in the southern part of Chasiv Yar. There are claims that the Russians are conducting a significant envelopment operation of Chasiv Yar. Interestingly, the Radovka, the Russian newspaper in Smolensk, has basically said that the core of the Russian forces in Chasiv Yar continues to be the 98th Airborne Guards Division, perhaps around 8,000 men in total, which, if true, would mean that the Russians are capturing Chasiv Yar methodically with a smaller force than the one the Ukrainians are using to defend it. Not the first time this has happened in this war. The paratroopers, of course, are relatively, the Russian paratroopers are, of course, light infantry troops, principally, though they do have tanks and some armored vehicles. But, of course, they also have enormous backing in terms of artillery power, and the Russian Air Force has always been very, very busy in Chasiv Yar. Anyway, so a lot going on there. There are also pretty dramatic reports north of the Kurakhovo Reservoir in General Mordvichev's part of the Kurakhovo battle. The Russians now, it is universally acknowledged, control the villages of Izmailovka, Zoryane, and Alexandropil, and the town of Girnik or Gornyak. There are reports that the Russians have also captured the village of Kurakhovka, one of the other villages in this pocket. The Russians also are apparently in the process of storming the last remaining village in this pocket, which is Vovchenka. The troops, the Ukrainian troops in this pocket, have been effectively encircled for some time. There are apparently pictures, which I have not seen, of large numbers of Ukrainian troops being taken prisoners. What I have seen is a picture of two Russian soldiers on top of one of the buildings in the central part of Kurakhovka, raising the Russian flag and saluting, and the whole village appears almost completely undamaged, which suggests that Ukrainian resistance in Kurakhovka, indeed in the entire pocket, has basically collapsed. No doubt, whatever Ukrainian troops were located in this pocket have mostly surrendered, though we don't have the exact details of this, and perhaps we never will. So it looks as if the pocket northwest of Kurakhovka has already collapsed. And Selidov, of course, is under Russian control, and further north in Kupiansk, in the Kupiansk area, along the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, the Russians have confirmed that they've captured another village along one of these rivers called Kruglyakivka, and there are reports that they now control around 60% of the village of Terny, about which there was a lot of fighting back in the spring, but the Russians now definitely seem to be close to capturing that village too, and the Russians continue to make advances apparently in Volchansk and in KURSK region. where the Ukrainians continue to suffer heavy losses. Group of forces north, without providing much in the way of detail, have recently, their most latest bulletin seems to have a very optimistic spin, and they're saying that they're continuing to make significant further advances south of Suja and one in the south of Suja area. So we'll have to wait and see what all that is all about. So when Peskov says that the Ukrainians are getting anxious and nervous, they obviously are. And one can understand why. The war is clearly being lost. And we can see all of these extraordinary maneuvers or these strange things that President Zelensky is doing. Now, I'm going to finish by repeating a piece of advice I have previously given. It's unsolicited advice. I'm not saying anybody of importance is paying much attention. I'm not flatter myself on that score, but we can always express what our views are. Whoever the next president of the United States is going to be, obviously we have the election next week, but whoever wins that election needs to close down the whole Ukraine project as fast as possible. Zelensky is all but out of control. In fact, he is out of control. The Europeans are incapable of putting together a coherent plan. That has also become obvious. No vital American interests are at stake in this conflict. Yes, NATO will suffer a blow to its credibility, but it's a blow it can easily absorb. Nobody should think that NATO is simply going to collapse because there's going to be some kind of defeat by the Ukrainians in Ukraine. What the new president needs to do is to put as much distance between himself or herself and their administration and this coming debacle in Ukraine as possible. And they need, above all, to begin those discussions with the Russians. Discussions about peace and security in Europe, discussions that look beyond the problem of Ukraine. There are going to be people like Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, and others who won't like that at all, but ultimately they are not in a position to object, and it would be stupid to give these sort of people a veto. The Biden administration gave Zelensky a veto over negotiations between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, and see what that has brought about. Anyway, those are my thoughts. My next program, I will return to the topic of the Middle East. And various comments, by the way, I've been receiving interesting comments from all sorts of people in light of my comments over my previous programs. So I'll be returning to that topic, but this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.